The number one reason that you're struggling to make arpeggios sound like jazz is because you're leaving out the most important exercises. After teaching jazz for 20 years, I created a method that fixes this and helps students play solos that really flow and nail the changes. So in this video, I'm going to show you this simple method and how you can use it to turn arpeggios into solid jazz lines. Let's start with the simplest arpeggio because even the basics can sound really amazing in jazz. Here's a 1-octave G7 arpeggio, and I'm going to show you why I start with this in a second. To hear how this fits in context, listen to how it matches with this G7 chord, because connecting your lines to the harmony really makes things a lot easier. Now let me first clear up a common misunderstanding. You've probably seen endless debates online. Should you start with scales or arpeggios? And people get really passionate about this. But if you look at the solos of jazz greats like this Charlie Parker phrase, you'll see that it's a mix of scales and arpeggios. Arpeggios are just the strong notes inside the scale. Scale and arpeggios fit together. They don't fight each other. So it's not one or the other, it's both. For now, try playing this G7 arpeggio a few times and get comfortable with the sound and the shape. Next, I'm going to show you how to turn it into a real jazz lick. There's one bad habit which holds back a lot of beginners when using arpeggios. Always playing the arpeggio from the root and playing it ascending. Now you need that, but you also want more freedom. And the most common suggestion for fixing this involves learning lots of complete positions and practicing even more exercises. Now this isn't necessarily bad, but it's not efficient if you want to get better at soloing. Instead, if you limit yourself to just a few notes while soloing, you'll actually start to develop something a lot more valuable. New melodies and your sense of rhythm and phrasing. And this is the secret behind the first jazz lick. This is about building your vocabulary and especially developing it in terms of rhythm. Think of the 4-note arpeggio as a scale and start improvising just using the arpeggio notes while focusing on making it sound great with rhythm and phrasing. Try simple things like sliding into a note, in this case, the third. Or using a pull-off to create more interesting dynamics in the line, here between F and D. This is the first type of jazz lick, arpeggio and rhythm. And when you start to make your own licks, like this one, then start with a short 3 or 4 note phrase. Or something like this. And once you have that, compose a longer lick. So play the first phrase, and then listen for what you might can come up with as a follow-up to this. And don't be afraid to just try some things. In the end, you'll start sounding like this. Composing licks is where you get much more free to play melodies and also where you can start developing better rhythmical ideas. Limitation can be a great way to level up your playing, but now we need to add some more notes to the mix. A lot of beginners make this mistake with arpeggios, treating them like they are isolated blocks that you can't change. But arpeggios are just a part of the picture. There are other notes from the scale all around them, and you can use all of those notes to make your solo sound more melodic and natural. And it is really just as simple as adding a few scale notes between your arpeggio notes. Check out this example and notice how you don't have to start on beat 1 every time. And you can still add phrasing to these busier lines, which gives you the second type of jazz lick. Once you start blending arpeggios with scale notes, you'll find it's much easier to create lines that flow and connect, just like the jazz greats. And there's a great exercise to help you practice connecting arpeggios and scales. Let me show you. Before we get into adding chromatic notes to your jazz vocabulary, let's quickly cover the most important way to practice arpeggios. You already know how useful it is to connect arpeggios to the scale when you're soloing, so it makes sense to focus on that connection in your practice as well. In this case, the G7 arpeggio is in the scale of C major, and a great exercise for any scale is to work on the diatonic arpeggios of that scale. Now, the way you do that is by building an arpeggio from each note in the scale, and it's pretty easy. For every note in the scale, you can stack thirds, and in that way create first the diatonic third intervals, then the diatonic triads, and finally the 7th chords for each note of the scale. And if you play this for the C major scale, then you get this exercise. This exercise builds an important connection, but you'll see later how it also opens up a world of other options. Now, once this feels comfortable, you'll be ready to add chromatic notes and more rhythms to your playing. Let's check that out. One of the most fun things about jazz is that you can use chromatic passing notes to create tension inside the line that then resolves. It's a bit like adding hot sauce to your playing. A little is great and it makes some bites hot, but you probably shouldn't overdo it. Now first, check out this example and then I'll show you how you can turn that into some strategies and exercises to use yourself. You have two kinds of chromatic approaches in this example, and both are important to know. First, a leading note for the third in the beginning of the example. Now, chromatic leading notes often work better resolving to chord tones, and a great exercise is to add them to all the notes of an arpeggio. Now, adding a note a half step under each chord tone gives you this exercise. The other approach is in the middle of the line where two notes are surrounding the fifth of G, the D. This is a chromatic enclosure. A chromatic enclosure is a short melody that moves to a target note. In this case, it's sort of coming from the previous exercise, but then combining it with a scale note. So you have the chromatic leading note, and then I'm first going up to the scale note above the chord tone, and then resolving. Again, you want to turn this into an exercise. So here you have an enclosure around each note in the arpeggio. And if you have the feeling that your solos are just running up and down scales and arpeggios, then enclosures will completely save your playing. Now we have the third type of jazz lick, which adds chromaticism. This almost doesn't sound like a G7 arpeggio anymore, but maybe that's also sort of the point. We're just getting started because there are actually more arpeggios that you can use over a G7 chord. You're not limited to the basic G7 arpeggio. Most beginners think that you can only use the official arpeggio for each chord, so a G7 arpeggio over a G7 chord. But great jazz players know that there's a whole system of hidden arpeggios that you can use to unlock new sounds and melodies. Here's how that works. Look at the notes of G7. So you have G, B, D, and F. Now the way it's constructed is by stacking thirds in the scale, and if you add another third on top, then you have a G7 with a 9. But now if you take away the lowest notes of the G, then notice that you have a B half diminished arpeggio. And that works over the G7 as well. So if you use the B half diminished arpeggio and add some chromatic notes, maybe a bit of phrasing, then you get this, which is the fourth type of jazz lick. This trick works everywhere. Try an E minor 7 arpeggio over a C major 7 chord or an F major 7 arpeggio over a D minor 7 chord. It sounds beautiful. Now suddenly you've got a whole new toolkit for jazz lines, and you will see this used everywhere if you check out solos from people like Joe Pass or Charlie Parker. And here's the best part, you don't always need inversions to get creative. Check out this next bebop trick, which is really one of the strongest in the book. Beginner jazz licks can easily sound a bit robotic just because you're running up and down scales and arpeggios in a very mechanical way. But here is a great Barry Harris technique that instantly fixes this. Usually we play the arpeggio starting on the root and then up the arpeggio. But instead you can move the root, so the first note G, up an octave. And then you get this, which immediately sounds 10 times more surprising without getting weird or abstract. You could explain this in a different way as well, but this is just easy on the guitar. Now moving the note up an octave gives us that large interval skip that sounds so melodic, and this is what Barry Harris called a pivot arpeggio. And again, this is something that works for all arpeggios, and you can create some really great lines with it. The fifth type of jazz lick is a pivot arpeggio bebop lick, and notice the grace note on the low note as well. Barry Harris pivot arpeggios are a fantastic way to level up your jazz lines, but they're just the front door. If you want to unlock the whole house of bebop, you need to check out Barry Harris' approach to chromatic notes. His chromatic scale method turns those outside notes into pure melody, and it is the real secret behind those classic bebop sounds. Check out this video where I break it down and also talk about why bebop scales are actually kind of a waste of time. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.